Hello, friends. This is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series I started a few years ago because I just wanted to sit down and talk with writers. I didn't necessarily want to read their books. I don't have time to read everyone's book that's coming on the show, but I wanted to get to know them as writers, what their journey was like, how they get their inspiration, how they've learned from rejection. Just because every writer has similarities, but every writer is vastly different. And I always in these conversations feeling like, oh wow, I learned something. I learned something new about writing today. That doesn't necessarily mean it's something I'm going to do, but I love just kind of studying the field of knowledge around writing. Speaking of writing, my Unbound Writer company is now offering. I have one retreat left in 2024 in October in Boulder, Colorado. I'm limiting it to only 10 people. So it's and I have new pricing around it. So I highly encourage you to check it out at unboundwriter.com. I'm so excited for this. And when we talk about writing retreats, I don't think I'm really calling it correctly because the quintessential writing retreat is writers get together and they just spend the day writing. That is not what this is. This is an immersive coaching program. Again, I don't believe there's one way to write a book. I think there's 1,000 different ways to write a book. So I'm never going to tell you this is how you do it. But we have a lot of instruction on the psychology of writing, overcoming blockages. And when we get to the craft part, certainly I'll talk about that. But it's more from a perspective of this is how I do it, rather than this is the way to do it. So I think there's a big difference there. So please check it out. There's early bird pricing going on right now. I do also offer scholarships. That all that information is on my website at unboundwriter.com. So on with the show. Today I had the great pleasure of talking to Dean Monti. So Dean's great. I had a fantastic conversation with Dean. I feel like we clicked, the conversation flowed. The storytelling portion was fantastic. But Dean is really a lifer. Dean has been writing. I mean, on his website, he even says he started writing when he was 2 or 3, but nothing legible until he was 5. But he has always been a writer at heart, um, whether it's novels or plays or even technical writing for his job, journalism. He has always been a writer his entire life, and his latest book is coming out in July, titled "Monosexual," the Monosexual, and it looks fantastic. Looks like it's got some great humor in it, so I'm very much looking forward to reading it. But we talked a lot about craft and a lot about getting that first draft done, and the beauty comes alive in the editing. We talked some about the industry of like, okay, you've written for yourself, you've written the book that you have found passion around, you've written it the way that you want to write it. Now, how do you sell this book? And he teaches that for aspiring authors, don't don't think about selling when you're writing the book. Think about the book that you want to write, which I think is fantastic advice and is very true. But then there's this cold hard reality about trying to get the book published, and then also knowing, as you're going through that process, what you can control and what you can't control, because you still want to be able to learn from rejection. You still want to hear advice, whether you decide to take it or not. But when it comes to things you can't control, of which there are many as a writer, trying to make their way through the publishing industry, you just have to let those things go. And so recognizing the differences between what you can control and what you can't. So anyway, this is a fantastic conversation. Like I said, I really enjoyed talking to Dean. I think you're going to like this one. This is my conversation with Dean Monti. You're looking very professorial.
Well, I watched a few of your podcasts. I was very impressed and everything. So I wanted to rise to the occasion here.
Even though I'm almost always in a t-shirt.
T-shirt, yeah. Well, that's okay.
I recently I go on these purges of my clothes, the once every year or two kind of a thing, and I purged like 8 hefty bags the other day, and I counted my remaining t-shirts, which of course I hang on hangers, and I still had 35 of them.
I know I can't. There's some T-shirts that I just have emotional attachments to, and I can't get rid of them. I'm also at work today, so I'm
Got it.
sitting at my desk. Yeah.
Tell me about your work.
Oh, I'm an air traffic controller, so I may need to. No, I'm not an air
Uh,
traffic.
you can't take time away from that.
I'm not. No, I write for a medical journal for the American Academy of Dermatology. So I've been doing that for 20 years. And then before that, I worked at another association, just doing feature stories and articles and news and all that stuff.
So you are immersed in writing.
I am, yes, very much so.
Well, I'm eager to hear about your journey because I was, reading about you and just seeing how you have you figured out just how to write for a living.
Mm,
With all the various ways that one can do that, you are doing that, and that's a rare thing because it's people I think have this fixed image in their mind of what it means to be a writer and
mhm.
a professional writer, and it's often very different than that. And if you have a love of writing, you need to you often need to scrape together a lot of different ways to do that in order to actually support oneself. The idea that hey, I'm going to sell a novel and retire is is a pervasive thought, and as pervasive as it is equally as ludicrous.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. When I was teaching for a while, people would come in and those would be the early questions is like, how to sell a book. And I would kind of early writers, I would dissuade away from that idea of selling and just work on your craft first and then see how it turns out. Um,
Right. Right.
yeah.
Because
Are those all your books in the background?
they are. Yep. I just had my ninth come out. But it's
That's
been
amazing.
it's
Wonderful.
been a over 20-year journey. And, as I often talk about, my first three books never sold. And you're absolutely right, because uh, and I also coach, right? And so one of the things I always start with my students is like, why are you doing this? Like, why are
Yeah,
you writing? And
exactly.
don't give me the answer you think is the right answer. Like, really think about it, because if that answer was because I want to sell books, it's probably not for you. If the answer
Yeah,
is because I can't picture myself not doing it, I just love doing this, the selling will come. If you lead with the passion, the selling is a byproduct of that, I think.
I completely agree. So yeah, that's why I stress people to work on their craft first and not worry about the finished product until they get much further along. Yeah, and see if it's for them as well. Because I think I read in your bio, because I do my homework, but
Yeah.
that you sat down and just like banged it out for like 400 pages. And I think that's an important part of the process is a lot of people don't even know, and I didn't know myself, if you can just sit down at a desk and like isolate yourself and write on a topic for 300 400 pages or whatever. So that in itself is something you have to learn.
Yeah, and allowing yourself to be terrible while you're doing it, like knowing
Absolutely.
that those 400 pages are probably going to be garbage. And I think that's what stops a lot of people is the idea of like, well, how can I write 400 pages if I don't know how to write well? Well, because those 400 pages will help you get there. And it might be
Exactly.
2,000 pages that will help you get to become a better writer. But you have to start somewhere, and people get such and the other thing that's I think people when they think about you, because everyone has a job, right? Everyone has a full-time job, and then they think about, well, I would love to write a book. And so you immediately categorize that love or that want as a hobby.
Yeah.
And you're immediately just diminishing it. So if it's like if I were to say I want to start woodworking, I would look at that as a hobby, and I would never think about I'm going to become a master woodworker. And I'm going to really put the time into it, and I'm going to start my own Etsy shop, and I'm going to sell, and I'm going to make a lot of money. You diminish it by saying it's just this little hobby. So you never give it the importance of a job, which it is, regardless of whether you're making money on it or not.
Yeah. Yeah, it for me, because I started so young, I think it's felt more like a calling that I was going to do something in writing. I mean, from a very early age, it's just never gone away, and it started
Yeah.
very.
So tell me about that. Like, when did it start? And you grew up, did you also grow up in the Chicago area?
I did, yeah. I've rarely set foot outside Illinois, as most people will tell you. I really need to branch out more. But no, in my bio, I joke that I started writing at age 3, but nothing legible till age 5. And that's it's a joke, but it's partly true because I was always writing something or creating something, whether I was asked to or not. So jotting things down on pads and things like that, little stories that I made up for myself. And then I was remembering this morning about when I was I think it was in like 6th or 7th grade, I was asked to write, the whole class had to write something about some historical event and research it and write a paper on it. And for reasons I have God knows why, I picked Lover's Leap. I just pulled it out of the air. I had no idea what it meant at all. And I thought, I'll go to the library because that's the only way you could do it back then, and research this, and I'll figure it out and write a paper. And of course, I could find nothing. So I made it up and turned it in. I think it was, I had not read Romeo and Juliet, but I'm sure it was something about, star-crossed lovers from different American Indian tribes that could not be together or something like that. Made up the whole thing, turned it in, and surprisingly, the teacher said, one person did a really wonderful job, and it was Dean Monti, and I'm going to read his story now. And then I was like mortified because I'm like, I made this up. This is not true at all. I did no research on it at all. So then I felt like just this awful guilt, because that's part of my personality too. And I went to the teacher like after class, and I'm like, I'm so sorry. This is just all made up. And of course, she thought so much more the better, that she was so much more impressed that I had actually like made this thing up.
Right.
And I thought, I'm still kind of doing that to some degree. I'm still kind of just really just making things up and hoping that they sound like the real thing, when you read them, that they have this real truth to them. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so are you, being that lifelong kind of creator, is that something that you evidence in your family? Are there other creative types, your parents, siblings?
My siblings I have a brother and sister that are both very creative. My brother paints, and he also used to write short stories. He probably does still write short stories, but he probably doesn't show anyone. But came from kind of a creative family, and then a family that just always had books in the house.
Yeah.
And the only comic books we had were these things called classic comic books, which are the classics made into comic books. So it was things like H.G. Wells and things like that, comic books and things like that. So very much literature and music in the household.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just this past weekend, I was actually I live in Colorado, but I was in California for a family memorial, and there was a bunch of us seated around this room, aunts and uncles I haven't seen in years, that kind of a thing. And I was talking to my cousin. I was thinking like about 50% of the people in this room are highly creative. They just want to work with their hands somehow.
Yeah.
And because there's a lot of painters in my family, a lot of artists of differing degrees. And then, I'm probably the only writer, but it all kind of boils down to that. I need to create something. And about the other 50% are more like engineers, which I don't have that in my brain at all. But it is kind of amazing. And I find like, I started writing in my 30s, like it will come out of you at some point. For you, it was coming out of you early.
I think that's an interesting point though, because I've always thought that it doesn't really matter what the creative thing is. So I started with short stories, and I think I tried like making comic books when I was very young and things like that. And sometimes it would be, then I turned to plays for a while, and then to short stories again, and then I started working on novels. But I always felt like I don't know what this is going to be. I just want to do something creative,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to figure out what it is that you're actually good at. So it's the desire meets talent, because I had I had very limited aspirations, but I always thought it would be cool to be to be a cartoonist. I'm like, that would be really cool. But I can't draw for shit. And then Dilbert came out, and I'm like, oh, you don't have to be able to draw. But by then I was a little bit too old. But I just knew that that wasn't my aptitude, even though it was for a lot of my family. And then I just kind of started writing. So what did you study? Did you study
I do have,
creative
by the
writing?
way, I do have my bad. I went through a period where I just was cartooning. That's all I was doing, was making these New Yorker style cartoons that are pretty clever, I guess, but hit and miss. But I can't draw for shit either. So
Yeah.
so they're just on my website as cartoons
Oh,
rejected by
that's
the
wonderful.
yeah. I'm sorry. What was the question you asked me
What
though?
did you study writing or creative arts?
I always took, if there was a creative writing class to be taken, I would take it. So I followed that course all the way into adulthood. So I was always very keen to take creative writing classes and got a lot of encouragement in those classes, along with some other good students who wanted to be creative. So yeah, always followed
Yeah.
that path, but no
What?
formal training. I did do an
Yeah.
MFA about what
Oh,
was that, 7 years ago.
okay.
Yeah, as
So
well.
what was that experience like? Because I'm always conflicted because I come at writing from the angle of zero experience, zero aspirations, self-taught, and I have nothing against classes. I teach classes,
Yeah,
but I very much believe there are a million ways to write a book. And
I
so
agree. Yeah,
what I tend to teach is more kind of the psychology of writing and getting unstuck and all that kind of stuff. And if I ever teach about craft, it's like, hey, here's how I do it. This may or may not be for you. But you then decided after years of writing different types of things to go and get an MFA. What was that experience like for you?
I think we're on the same page about those things. I got an MFA because I thought I might want to teach. Most of my education with writing along the way has been it's sort of like take what works for you, take what resonates with you, right? I mean, I've read certain books. I don't think there's any one formula for the kind of writing that I do, but I take little bits of this and that resonate with me. So really my MFA experience was partly just confirming that I was on the right track.
Mhm.
Um, and I
Got
think
it.
I've been a very intuitive writer, and a lot of it has been confirmation that, oh, yeah, other writers do this and it works for them, or you can structure something this way and it can work. Uh, and then little things like, I've experimented with changing one of the last things I did in my recent novel was change the tense, I believe, to present tense to give it a more immediacy. But that was
Mm.
just because I had read another author and it had worked, Carol Anshaw, her latest book, and it had worked really well for her to move the pacing along. So little
Yeah.
things up, right?
Well, that's more than a little. I recently changed a book from third person past to first person present, the entire manuscript, because I
Okay.
normally write first person present. And
Yeah.
I doubted myself going into this last book because the POV was so different from mine that I didn't think I could pull it off. And it just didn't work. And I've always found that like POV, I think ultimately when you find the point of view and you've got to make decisions obviously around the story and how much information you want the reader to have and this and that, but really, when you try and find that point of view and that tense that just flows out of you, I think that's really synonymous with finding your voice. Like, oh, this is how I write, and this is my style because I've chosen. And for me, it's first person present. Usually, is totally singular
Yeah.
point of view because it's just more interesting to me, and I'm good at it, and I'm not as good at the other things. Um,
And I think
but
that,
you have
yeah.
to go through the trial and error.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's how you find your voice is by playing with those aspects of it. And I mean, gosh, no time wasted rewriting a book, because you go through the whole thing and change the tense, and you're telling yourself the story again. You're finding different things that you might want to change.
Totally.
I mean, I never regret anything that I probably regret some things that I write, but I don't regret much, because it always is teaching me maybe what is not my voice and what doesn't work in a certain novel. So I don't think
Right.
there's any wasted writing. I think all of it is a learning process.
which is another blockage for a lot of aspiring writers, is this idea that um it's not it's not good enough. I haven't found my voice. And it's like, I don't go back and look at my old books. Like I don't want to say I'm embarrassed by them, but it's like it's even the published ones, I'm like, yeah, I'm totally different. Right. But that was a representation of my very best effort at that time. And
Exactly.
that's what
Exactly.
was happening in my life. And I always think about it, it's like TV shows. It's like I think like if I'm true to myself, one of my favorite TV shows of all time was Get Smart, which
Yes.
if you looked at that now, it's probably a terrible hokey show.
It's great. No, it's great.
But
Yeah.
at the time when I was young, it like I just was so excited for that show because that was a representation of what I liked and what affected me. And we, time moves on and we become
Yeah.
different. So you're right. There's nothing wasted. It's just who you are at that time.
Yeah.
Um, even if you lose, sometimes you'll lose a few pages, maybe for whatever reason, you delete them accidentally, and which is really frustrating. But then it's like, okay, how can I make this better than it was without even knowing exactly what I had written before? So it's still not wasted.
I have a radical theory that if you're really serious about wanting to write books, this is not advice for any of your listeners, but what you should do is write an entire draft and burn it. Because
Yeah.
if you really return to it, because I've done this because I always start out on manual typewriters. That's just how I roll. But
Mm.
if you type it all out and you have to start again, I don't look at that as I'm working on the second draft. I'm remembering what was best about that draft because those things stay with you. And if you keep those things that were the strongest parts of what you were putting together, I think you're going to have something better in the next draft.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and that's a lot of self-flagellation, that methodology right there, but it works for you. And there's this author, Stuart Turton, who's become pretty well known, and he's a buddy of mine. And I just interviewed him on his book tour, and he doesn't outline, neither do I, but he doesn't outline, and he writes maybe 110,000 word draft, and then he deletes the entire thing,
yeah,
like deletes it off of us. And the second draft he writes is usually not even related to that first draft. It's an entirely different story. There might be one
I think it's
character,
great. Yeah. Mhm.
but it's funny because he almost like hates it, the fact that that's what he does, and it takes him 2 years to write a full book, work like literally writing 8 hours a day,
Yeah.
because of that process. But that's his process. And I think so many writers are captivated with this idea of like there's this formula, or there's this writer who I'm going to follow their, like, well, you could, like you said, you could try all those different things, but it's got to come to you naturally at some point, or you're going to hate it.
Yeah. And that's very much part of my process is from the first novel, and I've written several and published two now, but the process has always been to come to it fresh and open and not preconceived with how I don't like to know the ending for what I do.
Right.
Some people
Me too.
some people like to figure that out ahead of time and plot it all out. It sounds like you don't use an
I don't
outline.
know anything.
Yeah,
Yeah. I know
yeah.
maybe the opening scene.
Exactly. So I find that's, I want to stay open to whatever can come into my mind that day, and that keeps it fresh for me. So I may read something, a fact, a historical fact or something that day that may find its way into the novel just because the universe brought it to me this particular day when I was writing or whatever. But I always like to come to it fresh and let it be whatever it wants to be and not force it in one direction.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you have a deeply rooted love of writing. So when you sit down for however long you write a day, that's non corporate writing, you're looking forward to it. You're like excited what's going to happen next. So then, and I always teach that too, is like write what you want to write. Don't worry about what everyone's telling you should write. But then there are market considerations there. You write the novel and then you're like, all right, what do I do with this thing now? And most novelists want to publish, obviously, which is a totally different universe than the writer's universe. So what has been, because you published your first novel, and that was a while ago, right?
It was a while ago,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
So, but you've mentioned that you've written several novels. So have you
Yeah.
gone down that process with them and saying like, let me get an agent, let me try to get it published, or,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I've come very close on a couple and some interest on another one that I'm working on recently, but ups and down with agents. I've had some very good experiences where there was another project that I worked on another book where a very good agent from the UK came over and we had dinner and she represented me and we really tried. She really thought it was going to go and just couldn't land it. So I put that aside, work on something else. So I'm always like going back. I don't give up on these works entirely. I just go back to them again with fresh eyes, like in 6 months or whatever, and see what's working, what's not working. It helps keep it fresh for me too to just rotate between projects like that.
What kind of feedback do you typically get? So, because that's always the consideration, right? Like you get enough agents or editors telling you, um, whatever. For me, it was like my first three novels that day when I went back through and read all those rejection letters from editors,
Yeah.
it was that my heroes were too weak. And I thought that
Interesting.
was interesting. And I looked at it, I'm like, well, yeah, I like weak heroes because I think that's kind of realistic because my heroes are usually everyday people who suffer a lot and they get defeated a lot and you hope that they win at the end. But I could see like, oh yeah, I guess nobody really wants to read about somebody being defeated throughout the entire book until the last chapter.
Right, right.
So I got that. So I changed my style but but sometimes you're like, you get this feedback and you're like, well, that's just not who I am. That's
Yeah.
so what
I've
have
been
you run
very,
into with that?
yeah, I've been very lucky in that both of these novels that I published have had very little editorial interference, and well, no interference at all. Just
Wow.
some helpful remarks here, but nothing that changed the story or anything like that. Because I have heard from authors who have had their books, changed quite a bit.
Yeah.
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 when
It's,
when you're
it's
writing, when you're like teaching and people say they want to write a thriller, like I wouldn't, I mean, I would know how to, I know how to build tension and conflict and all that, but I wouldn't know, is there certain things that you teach them about, like what you're good at?
I mean, it's funny when I wrote my first book and I was very fortunate after 75 rejections to get an agent with it. And this is a book that didn't sell. It was my
Yeah,
agent who told me I wrote a thriller and I had no idea. I just wrote a story. I didn't know what
there you go.
genres even were,
Yeah,
which was ignorance was bliss. But I mean, I think the main thing now, and now that I'm doing a lot more of it, is really kind of like pulling somebody in literally within 3 pages. And that doesn't mean there has to be a body, but there's got to be a sense of menace, a sense of dread, and it
sure.
could just be somebody talking and you want to pacing is a huge part of it. Word count has got a pretty tight range ultimately.
Right.
um but I find genres so fluid.
Yeah,
Sometimes mine they're tinged with horror, my editor will say. Sometimes, I mean, you look at Stephen King, who's known as this horror writer, and I read Stephen King a lot. I'm like, well, he doesn't really write a lot of actual horror anymore.
yeah,
He writes he writes thrillers, mysteries, or just almost meditations on somebody's life, um, or even sci-fi fantasy. But he's
right.
known as a horror writer.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Yes.
so I kind of eschew the idea that there are these rules, but I do know from an agent and editorial perspective that if you haven't sucked somebody in 5 pages in a thriller, then it's going into the slush pile.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I just wrote an article for Writer's Digest. I think it's coming out um, next month about conflict. I feel like you have to establish conflict like right away, or you're going to. The worst thing you can do is put something on the page and the reader has like any reason to jump out.
right,
Um, so
right.
I try and establish some sort of conflict. Usually, it's an absurd conflict or some awkward situation, but something that has to be established right away to get the reader turning the
Totally.
page.
And that doesn't mean it has to be conflict between two people. It could just be a conflict that the protagonist
Correct.
has something
Yeah.
that they just got fired or whatever. some kind of struggle. And I find like what a lot of other people do, aspiring writers, is they introduce way too many characters in a thriller in the first 5 pages, where it's just like, all right, now this is homework for me.
Yeah.
Or they are immediately giving you, here's all the information you need to know about this guy. And I'm like, I don't want any of that.
Yeah.
Not giving the reader credit for their own imagination. And it's okay for the reader to be lost. Some of the best TV I watch is where I'm just thrown in and I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. Like
Yes,
Breaking
I agree.
Bad, the pilot
Yeah.
of Breaking Bad is a great example of that. Like you don't know anything what's happening in that opening pilot, but all you want to do is know more. Uh,
Yes.
and to me, that's a thriller. It's like confusing, but emotionally tangible.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Breaking Bad, I actually started twice and it wasn't doing it. And then
yeah,
once I got past 1 to 2 to 3, then I binged the whole thing. Yeah. It was
right,
yeah.
right. Because it's the ultimate story of protagonist transformation.
Yes.
Because there's something so special about introducing the ability to have a protagonist that everybody is rooting for, and slowly peel away kind of what you like about him, and
Hmm.
to see, like, do you still like him? Do you still empathize with him at the end? And you do, even though he's completely changed. And
Amazing, isn't it?
that's amazing.
Yes, I agree. That's such an amazing feat when you can take a character like that, morally ambiguous, and just like you're totally rooting for them. Those are the most interesting characters to me. Yeah.
So what was the for your book coming out? I believe it comes out in July.
July 16, I think. Yeah.
Okay. What was kind of because I read the description of it, the monosexual, and I'm like, this sounds
It,
really compelling. What
it,
was when you sit down to write, is it always just a totally different story than the last one?
yes, yes. Um, and in this one, it was just like the first part of the book, where the character wakes up in the hospital and doesn't know what has happened, came later. It just started with some work things and some journals and some things I was writing down, and then it built. I just always build out from here and there, and then I ended up coming back to the beginning and then giving a more narrative arc that way.
Yeah. And are you, because you're not outlining, are you, if you're like me, it all comes alive in the editing, like the first draft is a bit of a mess.
Yep. Yeah. I just allow, yeah, I think it's just, to me, it's just very important to let out what's going to come out and not judge it as it's coming out. And then
Right.
later, yes, I will be very diligent about making sure that things are consistent throughout the novel, that things make sense, if they need to, particularly if I'm going to try and sell it to somebody, it has to make some kind of sense to someone. So I'll look at. I do like editing though, because
Yeah.
usually it opens up more possibilities to add the kinds of things that I like to add to a book. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you said is right, like in terms of like just allowing things to come out. And I think authors tend to discredit or not think about how much information and how much propulsion the subconscious contains. And you're
Yeah.
writing and you're so easy to doubt yourself because you're like, oh, this sucks. I hate it. Um, but it's probably better than you expect. So when I go back and start editing, it's rare that I'm gutting it.
Yeah.
Uh, but it's more than just a light edit, but it's less than gutting. And I'm like, all right, this was better than I thought because I was allowing my instincts to just, proceed onward. And a lot of writers, I think, don't do, they stop themselves.
My first draft will probably be something to see if I can go to the distance with it. Do I have enough ideas to carry this
Right.
through
Is
to what?
this a full story? Right.
Right. Yeah. So that'll be the first test. Then the second test is what of this is important? What is the story here, and what is important to it? And then I probably will trim back and add on, yeah, back and forth, like that crazy metaphor of a sculpture. You cut away everything that doesn't look like an elephant, and you end up with an elephant. So yeah.
Right. Right. But that's harder for a new writer to have those instincts to know. And that's why you just
No.
have to, I remember starting out, just find the critique group, find non-family members who can read and give you very honest feedback, because you just don't even, you have no, for someone like me, I had no clue. So that's
Yeah.
why it was important for me to be traditionally published, because I needed some kind of third party verification that I wasn't terrible. But you deal through a lot of rejection when you do that.
Yeah. I will tell you an interesting story about rejection, though, for your listeners. That is kind of interesting. Is that years ago with my first novel, Sweep of the Second Hand, I had queried um, Penguin back when you could do that sort of thing. I don't think you can even directly query them now, but they rejected me, and I held on to that rejection letter. And flash forward 10 years, when it was published by an independent publisher, the people that bought the paperback rights were Penguin. So, I mean, you never really, because publishing changes, and I think readers need to understand that one editor's opinion does not define you. There's so many people out there and so many different editors, and you just need to find. And as you know, anyone who's gone through the publishing process knows that they're investing a lot of resources in you. So if they don't believe in you, you don't want to push that. You want someone that really believes in this book that you're doing and will really get behind it. Yeah.
Right. You'll never argue your way into a book sale.
Exactly.
It's like trying to argue with reviewers, which is about the worst possible thing that you can do. But you're right. I mean, you have to learn as a writer what it was within your control and what's not.
Yeah.
And if you're getting a bunch of rejection letters from editors or from agents saying, you know, your writing is exceptional, the story is just not right for me at this time,
Yes.
that's uncontrollable.
Mhm.
And that is the probably the vast majority of rejections on an editorial level, because they are usually looking for something very specific, and it's got to hit that, like you said, that person the right way. But when you do have that editor who embraces it and is a champion for it, there's nothing better, because
Yeah.
they're gonna fight for marketing dollars and PR dollars and launch dollars and tour dollars, which which is a very scarce commodity from
Mhm.
even the largest publishing houses these days. I
Yeah.
know that, I suffer from that too. I'm like, oh, can we just, so I always hire my own PR team in to work with their PR team, because I want to
Yes.
give it every possible
Great
chance,
opportunity. Yes.
but
Right.
it's expensive.
It is. Yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
work actually with Chicago-based K Publicity.
I do
Um,
too. Yeah. Mhm.
oh, you
Yeah.
do? Oh, that's right. I
Yeah.
think that's how this got set up. Right.
Okay. Great. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you reached out to them and right. And it's so I tend to talk about PR a lot because I find it fascinating, because you can't measure the ROI on it.
Yes.
You can be as analytical as possible, but it's such an opaque industry, and to say X effort resulted in Y amount of sales is nearly impossible.
Exactly. Yeah. You can. You can just put in your best effort on these things, and it helps me to have an intermediary to say, well, Dean Monti has this thing. It's not me saying it, but somebody else saying, we have this thing we'd like you to take a look at. That helps me because I'm not really good about publicizing myself and putting it out there. I need to be. You have to be, but yeah, it helps to
Right.
have a.
Yeah. I mean, that's the sad reality of these days. And some people are very good at that. In fact, some people get book deals because they are TikTok influencers.
Yeah.
And I've interviewed a couple of them and they're great, but it's also very much like, oh man, like it's- but
I'm
Kay
no, I'm
actually, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, I was gonna say I'm just old school enough, and my last
Right.
where I feel like it should be more about the book than about me. And you do read a lot of articles these days that talk about image and image building and things like that, and that's fine. I understand it and all that, but I still want it to be more about the book than about me. So
Yeah, and also having a self-awareness about who the me is, and am I
Yeah,
a marketable person, and is anyone interested in a middle-aged white guy? Um, so Kay gave me great advice years ago, and they basically said, look, you don't have to do everything, and do what you like, if there's anything you like, and do what maybe you're good at. So find those things, at one point they're like, you should be posting every day on Instagram. I'm like, I'm just not going, that's just not who I am.
I feel the
Um,
same way. Yeah, yeah.
but that's okay. So, but one of the things I embraced, for example, was my monthly newsletter. I'm like, I am going to commit to that, and I mostly write about personal stuff. Like I don't mention my books all that much, but I do
Mhm.
it every month, and I've been doing it for
Yeah,
6 years, and it's a lot of work, but I enjoy it. TikTok, I don't enjoy, and I don't do a lot of it.
right. Yeah,
I'll put clips of making it up on TikTok because that's easy and I can repurpose it.
yeah,
Um, but there's got to be something, and there's some people who don't even have a website, and agents and editors, they're interested in your query letter. That's the first thing they're going to look. They're going to Google you.
yeah.
So you have to have some kind of presence. But it doesn't have to be this over the top, that you're giving TED Talks every other weekend or anything like that.
And if you, it's tricky. It's a double-sided coin because you want to work on publicity, but it also takes you away from what you really love to do, which is writing,
Right.
the
Right.
actual books. So,
Yeah.
and I'm going through. I don't know if it was on your podcast or someone else, an author recently talking about that they will do the publicity that they need to do, but really they just want to get back to the writing. So
Right.
yeah,
Which is why, you just mentioned your Writer's Digest, and Kay is great about booking guest articles.
yeah,
Like, that's writing. And I
yeah,
get to have a thoughtful essay that isn't directly, marketing my books, but it is marketing for you. And then, you might be able to have an opportunity to repurpose that later on. And so
yeah.
it's not, so that kind of stuff is great, but I only write an hour a day, so I have time to do some of the other stuff, but yeah, you can't really spend more than an hour a day on social. I mean, it depends on what time of year it is relative to your book launch and things like that, but um, and also your audience is going to get sick of just hearing all the time. I I've got a book out in 6 months. I've got a book out in 5 months and 20 days.
So with now that I'm about a month out, I'm going to have to pick up that sort of side of me that is outside my comfort zone. But I definitely want people to go out and buy the book and see the book. So yeah, I'll be doing a lot more of hosting and yeah,
Yeah, and that's fine because you're especially if you're advertising dates or if you're doing giveaways,
yeah,
people always love a giveaway. Um, I find whatever I can do to build my newsletter list, because then I own those names,
mhm,
um, is great, because then if I do happen to have a non-newsletter message for everyone, which is rare, but then I have an audience that I can push something out to.
yeah.
But no one thing works. It still to this day is all, to me, when I look at really like um newer authors who are becoming bigger authors, so much of it is that organic word of mouth that you can do enough to get yourself in the conversation through hiring your own PR team, doing all that stuff. um but where it goes from there is again one of those things that's out of your control.
And I've had to. I feel like just for me personally, that's why I'll put it out into the world and I'll continue to work on it and I'll continue to query. But I really have to remind myself, particularly during this process of publicity and all this and publishing, that the greatest joy I get is from the creative part of it. And the greatest
Right.
joy I get is when I have those aha moments of flow, when I'm really into it, when I can't wait to get back to it. Those are the moments that are really the most meaningful to me, if I'm being
Right.
honest. So
Right.
yeah.
And those are the most important, because for everything anyone does, I think the reality for 99% of writers is the story has to be good. Like it has to, that's the bare minimum that has to happen for anything to have any kind of success.
Yeah.
And when you are having that joy, that translates into good writing, I think, because you're being honest as a
Mhm.
writer. And if you have a shit story because you're trying to be formulaic, but you're really great at all the social media stuff, I don't think that I don't see where the fulfilling part of that is, or how it, readers are not going to be fooled by that.
Yeah, that's how I feel. And I hope I hope you're right, because I think you are. I think that if you are really putting the joy and passion into your work, then that will pay out in dividends. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're and if you're willing to listen, if you're
Yeah.
willing to learn from the rejection and know what advice is good advice and what advice you don't want to take, because you certainly don't want to take all the advice, because
Right.
your book will be some kind of weird bastard at that point. But you have to be open-minded. I mean, when I get my editorial letters from my editor, they're, they're a lot of work.
No.
And it's never like telling me this is what has to change. It's telling me this is how I felt about this character. Or it would have been nice to see more of this. And but leaving it to me to like solve the problem, which I appreciate because I don't want to be told
See,
what
that's
to
the
do.
perfect, yeah, I think that's the perfect kind of feedback, is just to let a writer know, hey, I got to this point and it stopped.
Or I'm
And
confused or
I'm
whatever.
confused. I didn't know who was talking here, or I think those are some of the best things that you can do, because again, you want to keep them turning the pages. You don't want to be taken out of the novel. So
Yeah, totally. Well, Dean, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, it's the fun part of the show where we do the storytelling, the making it up part of the show. I've chosen 3 books very much at random off my bookshelves, and I'm going to have you choose one of these books, and then we're going to choose a random page and a random sentence. I'm going to read that sentence, and then that'll be the first sentence and maybe a 2-minute long short story. So I'll read that sentence, and then you give me the next 1 or 2 sentences of what happens next. Then I'll do a couple sentences, and we'll see what a shit show it turns into.
I'm game.
Uh,
Let's try it.
these are very disparate books. I've got Douglas Adams' The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul.
I read
Um,
that one. Yes,
yeah, a lot of people don't know this particular book. It's a
I love
great
that one.
book.
Yeah.
David Bell's Kill All Your Darlings, and Jeffrey Deaver's The Final Twist.
Okay.
So choose one of those.
I'm going to go with Douglas Adams because
Oh, good man. God, what year was this book? I have to see
I
because
went through a
this
whole
was,
period where I like discovered him late and then just ate up all his works.
yeah,
So
I discovered him as a teenager, and I'm just like, who is? And he died very young. He was like 43, something like that. This is 1988, one of his later books. Give me a page number between 1 and 306.
83.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly. It's the beginning of a chapter. I'm going to quickly scan it. All right, I'm just going to read the first sentence of this chapter.
Yeah.
By the end of the morning, Kate had discharged herself from the hospital.
She wasn't sure what was wrong with her, but she had a continual ringing in her ears. It stopped, ironically, when the phone rang.
She was halfway through her drive home, doubting she could even make it there because of the ringing. She picked up the phone. The voice was familiar, but she didn't quite understand who exactly it was.
It sounded like one of her ex-boyfriends, but she wasn't quite sure because the voice was pitched up a bit higher than normal. It reminded her of being with this person in the past.
What was completely foreign to her were the 3 words, and only 3 words, that the voice said before hanging up. Don't go home.
So she didn't go home. It was lunchtime and she was passing by a Subway. So she decided to stop in Subway, uh, have a foot-long sandwich, and muse on her past relationships.
It was there she remembered something: her security cameras. As she finished off her sandwich, she opened her phone and navigated to her security cameras app. There was no activity that had recently been recorded, so she decided to launch the live view of her living room.
Inside her living room, she saw a shadow near the bookcase that she couldn't quite look like an arm and part of a head, but she couldn't make it out completely. It was a male form and it looked familiar to her.
What was definitely recognizable was her 8-year-old black lab. He seemed fine, but he just stood there staring at where this shadow was, rigid as stone, not barking, but certainly not looking relaxed at all.
She was surprised when suddenly a bowl came down and the person was feeding the black lab from food that he had found in her cabinet.
All right, let's call it there, because I was about to go to a place that I would have gotten really in trouble.
Oh, yeah.
There was going to be some kind of rat poison bag that she saw in the background.
Oh, I like that. That's good.
And then there would have been many, many complaints because
Oh,
I
wow.
killed a
That's
dog
good.
once in a book and I got like raked over the coals for it.
That's really fun exercise. That's good you do that. Yeah.
It is. It's the classic improv yes and theory that, you get in your mind like, oh, I see where this is going, and then you give me something new that, okay, I have to accept this premise and keep building with it. I personally love it, and I think it's such an interesting psychological process, because I do it with everybody. So, but everyone's different. Like my connection with people is
Yeah.
different. Sometimes it's just like, oh my God, like this is really, really difficult. Other times, like here, it was just, okay. It was just flowing.
Yeah, I took some improv classes and I do recommend them for this very reason is it can really open things up to new ideas like that. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I've noticed over time is the people who don't outline, who are pantsers, I think are better at it. I had one very well-known author who she's like, I physically can't do that. My fingers have to be on keys in order for words to come out of me. And I'm
Yeah.
like, that's so interesting.
You know
So
what? I probably am sort of that person too, but that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah, no, you flowed with it. Well, listen, congratulations on your upcoming release of the Monosexual, and that's very exciting. And it
Thank
was
you. This was so fun,
yeah, it was
Carter. I
great
really,
talking to you.
yeah.
So I hope I get to meet you in person someday.
I hope so. Yeah. I'll be happy to come back anytime.
Awesome. Thanks, Dean. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
Bye. So that's it. That is my conversation with Dean Monti. And I told you that the storytelling was a good one. I love the idea of launching your security camera and seeing somebody in your house, but for some reason it didn't record any activity. That's just creepy because it makes you think like maybe it's a ghost or something. So I think that story had a lot of potential. Dean's new book is The Monosexual, out in July 2024. And please go research and read everything you want about Dean and his book at DeanMonti.com. And please hop on over to my websites, carterwilson.com and unboundwriter.com. And I'll just reiterate, there's early bird pricing for my October retreat in Boulder, Colorado, 2.5 days where you can find community, inspiration, motivation, and confidence in your writing. I can't wait for this retreat. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's always a lot of fun, limited to only 10 people. So a chance to have one-on-one time for sure. So check that out. More episodes of Making It Up will be out next week. In the meantime, thanks as always for watching and or listening. Take care.